Those illegal antennas are creating electromagnetic interference and violating our community aesthetic standards. We're exercising emergency authority to disconnect your internet service until you remove that eyesore immediately. That's what Kenneth Southern announced while standing in his signature pink dress shirt and black dress pants beside my perfectly legal amateur radio tower, clipboard pressed against his chest like a shield while his contractor prepared to cut the fiber optic cables that connected my mountain retreat to the digital world. The morning air carried the scent of pine needles and fresh electronics, while Kenneth's voice echoed off the aluminum framework my grandfather had erected in 1967. His pink dress shirt gleaming with the kind of entitlement that thinks expensive clothing grants authority over federal communications law and spectrum regulations that predate his precious HOA by 6 decades. The sweet irony was that Kenneth's clipboard contained fake emergency orders, while my briefcase held something that would make his entire $85 million development go permanently offline. My Federal Communications Commission credentials and the exclusive regulatory authority to revoke every broadband license, cellular tower permit, and internet service provider authorization serving his community with one phone call to Washington. I'm Commissioner Robert Chen, Senior FCC official and former Federal Communications Regulatory Enforcement Specialist, and I stood there watching Kenneth prepare to cut my internet while calculating spectrum violations, unlawful interference charges, and the federal penalties that would make his pink dress shirt a prison uniform within months. What Kenneth didn't know, while he declared my FCC-licensed amateur radio equipment illegal antennas, was that every internet connection, cell phone tower, and broadband service in his development operated under federal licenses I controlled through 40 years of communications regulatory expertise. His internet disconnection wasn't just harassment. It was systematic interference with federally licensed communications equipment that would trigger FCC enforcement, FBI investigation, and federal prosecutors who specialized in protecting America's communications infrastructure from suburban terrorists in pink dress shirts. The beautiful irony was that Kenneth's communication sabotage would become the catalyst for his complete annihilation, when federal agents arrested him for interfering with licensed radio operations, while I demonstrated exactly what happens when HOA presidents forget that radio spectrum is regulated by Washington, not homeowners associations. In 6 weeks, his pink dress shirt would be replaced with orange prison clothing, while federal judges sentenced him to decades in prison for crimes against America's communications infrastructure and the constitutional rights that protect free speech from clipboard tyrants. What would you do if the HOA cut your internet and claimed your FCC-licensed equipment was creating electromagnetic interference while violating community aesthetics? Where are you watching from? Drop your state below because this story will teach you exactly how federal communications law works, which agencies prosecute interference with licensed operations, and the specific legal strategies that turn clipboard authority into federal terrorism charges when pink dress shirt tyrants forget that the airwaves belong to the American people, not homeowners associations. After 40 years regulating America's communications infrastructure and protecting licensed radio operations from interference, sabotage, and commercial exploitation, I'd earned my peaceful retirement on the 100-acre homestead my family had owned since territorial days. The property sat on elevated terrain in rural Montana that provided perfect line of sight for the amateur radio station my grandfather had established in 1967, complete with a 70-foot tower that had weathered decades of mountain storms while serving emergency communications during disasters, search and rescue operations, and the kind of public service that made amateur radio operators America's invisible first responders. The amateur radio system itself was a masterpiece of 1960s engineering, constructed from military surplus aluminum with guy wires anchored to concrete foundations that could withstand 100-mile-per-hour winds. Grandfather had been a licensed amateur radio operator since 1952, serving as emergency coordinator for 3 counties and maintaining communications during the 1976 Big Thompson flood that killed 144 people. The Federal Communications Commission had recognized our station's public service record in 1985, designating it a special event station with enhanced operating privileges and federal protection under Part 97 regulations that guaranteed our right to maintain effective communications regardless of local zoning restrictions or HOA interference. My internet service relied on a sophisticated fixed wireless system that used FCC-licensed spectrum to provide high-speed broadband to rural areas where fiber optic cables weren't economically feasible. The system operated under strict federal regulations that protected it from interference while ensuring it didn't cause problems for other licensed services. My antennas were precisely engineered, properly installed, and completely compliant with FCC Part 101 regulations governing fixed microwave services. Then Glacier Peak Estates sprouted on adjacent valley floor like an expensive suburban infection, 347 McMansions with manicured lawns and enough HOA regulations to choke a federal regulatory library. The development's residents were mostly wealthy retirees seeking exclusive community living without the visual clutter of working infrastructure, utility poles, or communications that reminded them of the technology making their lifestyle possible. Kenneth Southern arrived in Glacier Peak like a corporate virus, wearing expensive clothing and delusions of authority over federal communications law. Recently retired from some telecommunications executive position where he'd apparently spent decades profiting from the same spectrum regulations he now wanted to violate for aesthetic reasons, Kenneth wore his pink dress shirt and black dress pants like a uniform of suburban conquest. During HOA meetings, he spoke in buzzwords about visual optimization and electromagnetic compatibility, code language for eliminating communications equipment through legal terrorism disguised as community beautification. Kenneth's obsession with my antenna system began during his first month as HOA president, when he declared my grandfather's tower a visual blight that compromised his development's exclusive character and property values. The first warning shot came via certified mail, claiming my antennas created electromagnetic interference and visual pollution that his HOA could eliminate through aesthetic compliance authority he didn't possess under federal law. I stared at the letter in disbelief. My amateur radio station was federally licensed, constitutionally protected, and legally secured by FCC regulations that had been established when Kenneth was still learning to tie his shoes. Kenneth's escalation peaked when he hired electromagnetic consultants to assess my antenna system for community compatibility issues. 3 unlicensed contractors whose expertise consisted of measuring equipment they couldn't identify while Kenneth supervised from his air-conditioned BMW, his pink dress shirt pressed crisp as his arrogance. Their assessment recommended removing excessive antennas, relocating intrusive towers, and installing aesthetic screening that would eliminate my station's effectiveness while violating federal regulations protecting amateur radio operations from local interference. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a communications engineer I'd worked with during my FCC regulatory career, reviewed Kenneth's modification proposals with professional horror. "Robert, these modifications would systematically destroy your station's effectiveness while violating FCC Part 97 regulations protecting amateur radio operations," she reported while examining plans that showed Kenneth's complete ignorance of federal communications law. He's recommending changes that would constitute willful interference with licensed radio operations, creating federal violations that carry substantial criminal penalties. But Kenneth's biggest mistake was underestimating who he was attacking. A simple internet search would have revealed my 40-year career regulating communications infrastructure, my current position as FCC commissioner with exclusive authority over spectrum management, and my direct control over the broadband licenses that kept his precious Glacier Peak connected to the digital world. The power lines serving Kenneth's development weren't the only infrastructure crossing my property. The fiber optic backbone providing internet service to his entire community ran through easements I'd helped negotiate during my FCC tenure. Agreements that included termination clauses for harassment of the landowner or interference with federally licensed communications equipment. My professional response was methodical and devastating. I contacted FCC Enforcement Bureau Director Rebecca Torres, documenting every violation, while Kenneth watched from his BMW. Commissioner Chen, this represents systematic targeting of federally protected amateur radio operations, she confirmed after reviewing my documentation. Your station operates under federal preemption that prevents local interference, and Kenneth's activities constitute willful obstruction under communications protection statutes. Special Agent David Rodriguez from the FBI's Communications Crimes Unit coordinated federal response with surgical precision. Commissioner Chen, your amateur radio station provides emergency communications for 3 counties, making it critical infrastructure under federal protection, he explained during our secure briefing. Kenneth isn't just committing harassment, he's planning systematic sabotage of federally licensed communications equipment that constitutes domestic terrorism. The FBI's involvement transformed Kenneth's antenna elimination project into a federal investigation targeting organized criminal activity that threatened protected communications infrastructure. My FCC contacts prepared federal enforcement actions that would demonstrate exactly what happens when HOA presidents attack the regulatory officials who control their broadband licenses. Dr. Evan Reed's forensic analysis of Kenneth's HOA finances revealed systematic embezzlement through shell companies and kickback schemes. $700,000 stolen through inflated contractor invoices and fake electromagnetic assessments, Reed reported, while spreading evidence across my kitchen table. Kenneth used phantom interference studies to justify unnecessary spending, then laundered money through his brother's telecommunications company. The first test of Kenneth's criminal stupidity came when FCC field agents arrived for routine monitoring of my amateur radio operations, only to find Kenneth's contractors had already begun preliminary antenna removal that included cutting coaxial cables and dismantling guy wire anchors. The FCC agents immediately called FBI communications crime specialists, who arrived to find Kenneth directing operations while wearing his pink dress shirt like a uniform of federal communications violation. Kenneth's response to federal investigation revealed his complete disconnection from reality. Standing in his pink dress shirt at an emergency HOA meeting while claiming his antenna elimination would improve community safety through electromagnetic reduction. The meeting was recorded by residents, creating audio evidence of Kenneth's callous disregard for emergency communications that federal prosecutors would present to juries. Meanwhile, I quietly activated the nuclear option Kenneth had handed me. As FCC commissioner, I had direct authority over the spectrum licenses that enabled every form of electronic communication in his development. The fiber optic cables, cellular towers, and broadband infrastructure serving Glacier Peak estates all operated under federal authorizations that could be suspended for violations of communications law. I began with a formal FCC enforcement action against the internet service provider serving Kenneth's development, documenting how their customer, Kenneth, was systematically interfering with federally licensed amateur radio operations in violation of their operating conditions. ISPs take these violations seriously because losing FCC authorization means losing their business entirely. Next, I contacted the cellular carriers providing service to the area, informing them of ongoing interference issues and potential violations of their tower site agreements. When cellular companies face regulatory scrutiny, they respond by immediately investigating and often suspending service to protect their broader operations. The beautiful irony was that Kenneth's campaign against my electromagnetic interference was about to create real interference problems for his entire community as service providers scrambled to avoid FCC enforcement actions triggered by his harassment of a sitting commissioner. The federal investigation accelerated when FCC enforcement specialists discovered Kenneth had been systematically researching other amateur radio stations throughout Montana, his computer files containing interference reports and elimination proposals targeting 17 additional licensed operations. His pink dress shirt had become a familiar sight at amateur radio installations where he'd posed for photographs while calculating visual impact and elimination costs of emergency communications equipment. Dr. James Wilson, a federal communications protection specialist, analyzed Kenneth's elimination plans with professional horror. This represents coordinated attack on federally protected emergency communications infrastructure disguised as community beautification, he testified during preliminary hearings. Mr. Sutherland has systematically targeted licensed amateur radio operations while using fraudulent electromagnetic assessments to legitimize commercial elimination of America's emergency communications capability. The civil lawsuits began immediately after Kenneth's federal arrest, with amateur radio organizations and emergency services groups filing damages claims against Kenneth, his HOA board, and every contractor involved in his communications sabotage conspiracy. Attorney Sarah Chen argued that Kenneth's deliberate targeting of licensed communications equipment constituted federal terrorism, warranting punitive damages exceeding his personal assets. Kenneth's desperate final gambit was attempting to claim electromagnetic safety authority for his antenna elimination project, filing emergency motions arguing his actions would reduce community radiation exposure. The legal theory was so absurd it violated basic First Amendment principles protecting communications freedom, but Kenneth pressed forward with motions that became evidence of his systematic criminal intent. The FBI's financial investigation revealed Kenneth's communications sabotage had been funded through systematic embezzlement from HOA reserves and kickback schemes involving his brother's telecommunications company. Special Agent Rodriguez discovered Kenneth had stolen $1.8 million from community funds while creating systematic liability for federal communications interference. The catastrophic test came when a major wildfire threatened Glacier Peak Estates, requiring immediate evacuation coordination through amateur radio networks that provided emergency communications when commercial systems failed. My amateur radio station served as primary emergency coordination point, but Kenneth's elimination project had systematically damaged backup communications equipment needed during exactly this kind of emergency. Kenneth's contractors had cut critical coaxial cables just days before the fire emergency, leaving the community partially isolated when cellular towers failed and internet service was interrupted by power outages. Emergency coordinators struggled to maintain communications with damaged equipment, while Kenneth complained about unauthorized emergency operations violating his aesthetic standards. But the real devastation came when I implemented the communications blackout Kenneth had unknowingly triggered. As FCC Commissioner, I had documented sufficient evidence of systematic interference with federally licensed operations to justify emergency enforcement action against all communications providers serving his development. The first domino fell when the primary internet service provider received an FCC enforcement order suspending service to Glacier Peak Estates, pending investigation of customer interference with licensed amateur radio operations. The ISP, facing potential loss of their federal operating license, immediately complied by disconnecting fiber optic service to the entire development. Next, cellular carriers received similar orders regarding tower sites within the interference zone. Rather than risk FCC sanctions, they reduced power levels and restricted service, effectively creating dead zones throughout Kenneth's community. Satellite internet providers suspended new installations pending resolution of the interference investigation. Within 48 hours, Kenneth's $85 million development was effectively cut off from the digital world. No internet, limited cellular service, no cable television, no smart home systems. The community that had demanded elimination of visual pollution from my antennas was now experiencing what life was like without communications infrastructure. The community reaction was swift and devastating for Kenneth's remaining support. Emergency HOA meetings erupted in chaos as homeowners discovered their HOA president had stolen their money to eliminate emergency communications equipment, while creating federal liability that had cost them all digital connectivity. Kenneth stood in his pink dress shirt trying to explain communications sabotage theories while residents realized the scope of his federal crimes. His claims about electromagnetic safety crumbled under the weight of federal communications law he'd never bothered to understand. The federal trial began with media coverage that transformed Kenneth's pink dress shirt into a national symbol of aesthetic tyranny and systematic sabotage of America's emergency communications infrastructure. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence of systematic communications interference, federal licensing violation, and criminal conspiracy that had endangered emergency preparedness for commercial aesthetic preferences. Kenneth's defense crumbled under cross-examination, revealing his complete ignorance of federal communications law and basic respect for America's emergency preparedness infrastructure. Wearing standard business clothing instead of his signature pink dress shirt, Kenneth appeared diminished while prosecutors played recordings of him defending his communications elimination during active federal investigation. FCC Enforcement Director Rebecca Torres delivered testimony that ended Kenneth's defense permanently. Mr. Sutherland's actions represent the most egregious violation of federal communications protection I've encountered in 20 years of spectrum enforcement, she stated, while prosecutors displayed photographs of damaged antennas and cut cables. His elimination project was specifically designed to destroy federally licensed emergency communications equipment. Dr. Sarah Martinez's communications engineering analysis demonstrated how Kenneth's elimination project violated every principle of emergency preparedness established by federal communications law. This represents systematic sabotage of federally protected emergency communications infrastructure disguised as community beautification, she testified. Kenneth engineered commercial elimination of emergency communications capability that prioritizes visual aesthetics over life safety communications. The financial evidence revealed Kenneth had systematically embezzled HOA funds while enriching family members through inflated contractor invoices and kickback schemes designed to profit from communications elimination. Special Agent Rodriguez testified about discovering $1.8 million in stolen community funds and shell companies designed to launder money through Kenneth's brother's telecommunications business. Amateur radio emergency coordinators delivered powerful victim impact statements demonstrating the human cost of Kenneth's communication sabotage. Emergency coordinator James Patterson described how Kenneth's antenna elimination had compromised wildfire evacuation communications, explaining how the sabotage had endangered hundreds of families while eliminating backup communications capability. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating in its technical precision and moral clarity. Kenneth Sutherland didn't just steal money or violate HOA regulations, Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert King stated. He systematically sabotaged federally protected emergency communications infrastructure for aesthetic preferences and personal profit. This isn't just communications interference, this is terrorism against America's emergency preparedness infrastructure. Federal Judge Patricia Morrison delivered Kenneth's fate with gravity reserved for those who attack America's constitutional rights. Mr. Sutherland, you systematically sabotaged federally protected emergency communications infrastructure while embezzling community funds, she stated, while Kenneth stood in shackles. Your conduct represents fundamental disrespect for communications freedom that demands maximum federal consequences. The sentence was devastating. 21 years in federal prison, complete asset forfeiture totaling $4.2 million, and restitution exceeding $16 million to amateur radio organizations and emergency communications restoration funds. Kenneth's antenna elimination equipment was seized by federal marshals and destroyed, symbolically eliminating his tools of communication sabotage while restoring my grandfather's amateur radio station to full operational capability. The restoration project became a national model for amateur radio protection that attracted support from emergency services organizations and federal agencies committed to protecting America's emergency preparedness infrastructure. Kenneth Sutherland remains incarcerated in high-security federal prison, his appeals exhausted, early release requests consistently denied. This attitude ensures he'll serve his full 21-year sentence while America's emergency communications networks operate without interference from pink dress shirt terrorists. The broader impact extended far beyond Montana mountains, as the federal prosecution became a landmark case, setting legal precedents for prosecuting HOA officials who target federally protected communications equipment. The Chen Communications Freedom Protection Act, new federal legislation inspired by this case, now mandates enhanced penalties for communications interference and strengthens FCC enforcement authority. For anyone facing similar attacks on federally licensed communications equipment, the lessons are crystal clear. First, document everything meticulously, every letter, email, threat, and interference incident. Second, know your rights under federal communications law, especially concerning amateur radio protection and constitutional guarantees of communications freedom. Third, contact FCC Enforcement Bureau immediately when HOAs threaten licensed communications equipment. Finally, never let fear prevent you from defending communications freedom against aesthetic interference by pink dress shirt tyrants who think HOA authority supersedes federal communications law. Kenneth thought his position made him untouchable, that he could sabotage federally protected communications equipment with impunity. His 21-year federal prison sentence proves no one is above the law when they violate America's communications freedom. 2 years later, I stood beside my restored amateur radio tower, breathing air that smelled like mountain pine and justice, while morning sunlight illuminated aluminum antennas that served emergency communications Kenneth had tried to eliminate. His communications sabotage had been the catalyst for his complete destruction, proving that some signals reach far beyond local interference, and that America's communications freedom has federal defenders who will protect spectrum rights from aesthetic terrorism.